again, and welcome back. This time I'm going to do something a bit different and have a look at some of the books that I've been reading over the last while. Now, as you can imagine, as a writer, I read quite a bit, and I also read, quite widely. I don't necessarily read science fiction, and I read a lot of non-fiction as well. So anyway, let's get into it. So the first up is this book, The Silk Roads, by Peter Fankopan, and this is a kind of a new history of the world. And what's interesting about this is normal kind of history. When you tend to learn it linearly. So we had the Greeks, and then we had the Romans, and then we had the European powers, and it's this kind of linear progression, through time, and history is done that way. Whereas what he does in the Silk Roads is he takes a completely different view and looks at it from the point of view of trade routes. Where are the trade routes? Who was trading with whom? Who controlled the trade routes? And then what he does is he sort of charts the rise and fall of empires along these trade routes, and as new trade routes develop. I mean, it all boils down to who had the resources and who controlled the routes and who was trying to basically take it from them. So it's a great read, actually. It's well written. I found that, every time I put it down, I was just dying to get back to it again, which is always a good sign with a book. Interestingly, I was reading this when that evergreen, the Ever Given, was stuck in the Suez Canal, so it kind of made the whole thing a bit more real for me. So anyway, if you're into history, well worth a read. I'll give it a thumbs up. So the next book is Range. So Range, How Generalists Triumph in a Specialized World. And I was kind of interested in this because I am a generalist. At least I imagine myself to be, because, I only started writing fiction in my 50s. Prior to that, I had a tech business, and, I've done all sorts of different things throughout my life. So, I'm convinced of the argument in this book before you even open the book and read it. And I'm also interested in the generalist because, as the world changes, and as I suppose life in a sense becomes a bit more complex, and we're dealing with a more complex society, will the generalist be a better option instead of the kind of specialist? That's kind of where my thinking is at, but having said that, I'm convinced of the argument before you open this route, but really, no. I think the problem with this book for me is that it's just really an info dump. He doesn't, present the argument. He says how generalists triumph in a specialized world, but he doesn't present that argument. He really just has gone and done a phenomenal amount of research, fair play to him, and then just dumps it all at you. So each kind of chapter is just a new info dump, and I found it difficult to read, and I found myself skipping through a lot of the chapters, and even trying towards the end, I didn't find that he summed anything up. So he really didn't present the argument well. So not for me, Next book, here's an interesting one. Utopia for Realists. That's great, doesn't it? Utopia for Realists and How We Get There. This is by a guy called Rutger Bregman. Now, he's Dutch. It was written in Dutch and it's translated into English. It's translated into 28 different languages. It's a big bestseller, and it's an interesting one. And what he's doing in this book is he's sort of advocating for the idea of universal basic income, which is a fairly bonkers idea. And unlike the other book, I'm not convinced of this argument before I got into the book. But again, unlike the other book, Range, this guy presents his argument really well. And similarly, he does it through anecdotes. So, he starts off and says, well, this is what it is, and this is why it's great, I think. And then he goes back and, throughout history, he gives you examples via anecdote to back up his argument. And at the very end, then he sums it all up and answers a lot of the hard questions like, well, who's going to pay for all this, And interesting, this was written before the pandemic, and why I was interested in reading this is obviously, now that we have sort of governments in the developed world anyway, are, essentially turning on the printing presses and giving people free money, I was interested in seeing how does that affect society, and how does that affect people, the pros and cons and the pluses and minuses of it. So if you're into sort of that sort of thinking, this is a great book. It's really well written and very easy to read, and presents the arguments very well. What else have I been reading? Well, I listen to a lot of audiobooks as well. And one of the audiobooks I've been listening to, I've been working my way through, is Neal Stevenson's The Baroque Cycle, which is a gargantuan book. I mean, as a book, I think it's something like 3,000 pages. So I think it's 8 books. But I've been listening to it on Audible. And it's Neal Stevenson, you'll probably know from science fiction books. So he would have written Seven Eves, very good book. And Snow Crash would be probably one of his more famous books. But the Baroque Cycle is actually historical fiction. I know he kind of calls it science fiction, but it's not really. It's historical fiction, and it's set around sort of 1640, 1660, in around that sort of time up until 1700, and really what the book, I suppose, is about, if you could say it's about anything, is about that sort of moment in time where the new world the new world thinking started. So the sort of scientific method started in around that sort of time, and new thinking in terms of banking. Like prior to that, if you wanted to buy something, if you were a merchant in Amsterdam and you wanted to go to London and buy some, I don't know, sheep, you would literally have to take the gold out of your bank and sail across, and then deliver the gold, get your sheep, and come all the way back. But this was the time when now you could go to your bank in Rotterdam or Amsterdam or wherever, and you would get a note that would be for the amount of gold, and you could claim that on their sister bank in London. So this was a whole new type of thinking. And similarly, in terms of the scientific method, and like prior to that, you had a kind of an assumptive view of the world. The world worked this way and that was it. Whereas now you're moving into more the scientific method. And it centers around 3 main characters. One is Roger Comstock, who's a natural philosopher, as they call it, basically scientist, and starts the Royal Society. So you have characters in there like Isaac Newton is actually quite a main character, and a very interesting character too. So Isaac Newton, 3 laws of thermodynamics, but he was also involved in alchemy. He was the head of the Royal Mint. He was an alchemist. So it's nice because he juxtaposes kind of the new way of thinking, the mathematical modelling in a sense, and the old way of thinking, which was the alchemist, and they were looking for the philosopher's stone and the philosophical mercury, and Solomon's gold and all this sort of stuff. And the other character is a character called Jack Shafto, who's actually my favourite character in the whole thing. And he's kind of this vagabond, rough and tumble character, from the streets of London, and he goes on these mad, wild adventures, pirating all over the world. I mean, the book spans the world, so it's Europe, it's Caribbean, the Americas, Japan, China, India. It covers everything. It's a great read. And the third character in it is a woman who's a kind of an enslaved concubine that Jack Shafto rescues, but she sort of becomes this wealthy, very influential duchess involved in finance and banking. So it's a fabulous read. That's what I'm getting through at the moment. But caveat, it's Neal Stevenson does go on a bit. He can waffle, like the best of them. So you can go through like half an hour of audiobook and really nothing has happened in the story. But the narration is very good, and I think that you can accommodate that more in an audiobook, I think, than you can in a print book, where you don't have to put the same effort in. And you can have it on. I listen to it in the car, and I listen to it at night when I'm going to bed. Anyway, there you go. That's what's going on in my head. For what it's worth. Anyway, listen, I better go, and I'll talk to you next time. Take care.